The Democratic Alliance leader, John Steenhuisen, says the war in Ukraine is everyone's war. He says South Africa should not be sitting on the bench. This is after his 6-day-long fact-finding mission in Ukraine, which has received backlash from some quarters here in South Africa. John Steenhuisen joining me now for that discussion. John, good morning to you. You addressed quite a lengthy briefing yesterday on your return from Ukraine. And part of what you said, John, and I'd like for you to just confirm it for us and perhaps explain what you meant by this when you said, and I quote, "I told Ukrainians, ANC doesn't speak for our country." Were those indeed your words?
Yes, Portia, you said it was a long piece. It wasn't long enough for Rebecca Davis, clearly. But yes, absolutely. I think the majority of freedom-loving South Africans, as evidenced by the poll that was conducted by the respected Economist magazine, that by far the majority of South Africans are appalled by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and do not support this illegitimate intrusion into the sovereignty of another country.
Mm-hmm. Factually, though, John, you and I know that the ANC is the governing party, more so at national level. They determine policy, and right now, the country's position when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict is that South Africa is standing in the middle, as they say. They're not taking any positions. Was that not misleading when you said that South Africa or the ANC does not speak for South Africans?
Well, their policy is also cater deployments, and I wouldn't like to think that either you or I support it, given the damage that it's done. Their policy is expropriation without compensation. I wouldn't think that we would be supporting it. Just because the government has adopted a position on something doesn't make it right. We must also not pretend that we're sitting in the middle on this particular matter. It's very, very clear from the ANC's actions that, in fact, they are very, very wary of upsetting Russia, which is why we had people at the embassy on the night of the invasion, our defense minister and the head of the SANDF, drinking champagne with the Russians, toasting their armed services. It's why senior people in the ANC won't call this a war. We mustn't pretend that we're covering up the ANC's own narrow financial interests with a cloak of neutrality. It's anything but. But I would make the further point that in times of great moral crisis, as Archbishop Tutu said, if you choose a neutral stance, you're choosing the side of the oppressor.
And you talk moral issues, John. And again, I ask you this question about whether or not you did not mislead Ukrainians when you said they don't speak for the people of South Africa. Unfortunately, they determine the law for the time being that they are in government. And again, I put it to you that you misled them instead of telling them that you are trying to persuade the leading figure in government, that is President Cyril Ramaphosa, to understand and maybe cajole him to see things the way that you see it as the main opposition in the country. Would that not have been a better stance?
No, not at all. I think I speak for freedom-loving South Africans who, on the side of democracy, are against imperialism and who see this as a gross violation of international laws and understand that this war is going to have significant knock-on effects to South African consumers and the average South African, and will have devastating impacts on the poorest amongst us as fuel prices rise, fertilizer prices rise, as food prices rise. I think that this government certainly does not speak for me. If you feel happy that they speak for you on this matter, that's your business. They certainly don't speak for me, and I don't think they speak for the majority of Democrats and freedom-loving South Africans in the position that they've taken, and their absolute refusal to condemn what is going on with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, well, whether they speak for me or not, John, the point is that they are leaders in government, and I've got to follow their lead in this instance. Yes, as an independent South African.
Adolf Hitler was the leader of his government. I would hope that you wouldn't have followed that slavish line there. As with any other dictators, Robert Mugabe was the leader of Zimbabwe. It didn't make what he did in his country right. Hugo Chavez was the leader of his country in Venezuela. I would certainly hope that good people in those countries would not simply say, well, because that's a position of my government, I'm going to support everything that they do.
Yeah.
I think it behoves us as Democrats, wherever we may be in the world, to stand up on the side of freedom and of democracy and of liberty.
Well, the good thing about our country, John, is that I can raise my voice as an ordinary South African because I have that freedom. That's at least part of what I enjoy. Let's try and move the conversation.
As do I.
Let's try and move the conversation and talk about the timing of your departure to Ukraine. How do you respond to people who say that perhaps it was ill-timed given the disaster that was unfolding in KZN, which, by the way, continues to unfold? 50 children, in part, as a result of this disaster, 50 children have died as a result of malnutrition.
Yes, Collie, absolutely. And that's why I was in KwaZulu-Natal a week before I departed to the Ukraine, where I delivered food aid to affected families and delivered a truckload of water to communities that had not received it. Quite fortuitous that you asked me this, because straight after this interview, I'm on an aeroplane back to KwaZulu-Natal to go and assess what's happening on the ground there, and after that onto the Eastern Cape to do the same thing. So I couldn't agree with you more. But just because you focus on one thing doesn't mean you're not caring about other things. You may be interviewing John Steenhuisen now. It doesn't mean you're not going to interview anybody else today on other matters of importance. These things are not one-dimensional. They're multidimensional. Just because you are focusing on one particular issue at a particular time doesn't mean that it crowds out the rest of them. And I'm looking forward to being on the ground again in KZN, because from what I've been able to witness and see, none of the promises that were made by the President in his address to Parliament 2 weeks ago have been kept.
Well, John, all I'm doing here is asking questions that people, the ordinary people of South Africa, some of whom, by the way, have voted your party into government in the Western Cape, are asking, and that is to say, what progress is being made to stem the tide of mass killings in townships in the Western Cape? Just yesterday, we have learned of yet another mass shooting in Khayelitsha.
I couldn't agree with you more, Ollie, and you're absolutely right. It is atrocious, and it's driven by the fact that the Western Cape, thanks to national government and the SAPS at the national level, has one of the lowest police-to-population ratios in the country. And that's why I led a march just before the election to the police stations there to hand over a petition calling for greater policing resources. It's also why our MEC, Regan Allen, was on the scene, and our Premier, Alan Windey, was at the scene at the hospital shooting, which you haven't mentioned, to go and assess the situation and see what we can do. It's also why the City of Cape Town and the provincial government, through the LEAP program, are putting resources into those communities at the province and city's expense to try and stem the tide against crime there, because there's just not enough policing resources because of the throttling that's happening there, because this is the Western Cape. The second thing that I think is also important to note is that the Metro Police has specific drug units that have been set up to deal with the scourge of drugs and gangsterism on the Cape Flats. But the reality is that it's not going to improve until we get a police-to-population ratio. And unfortunately, as you know, that is the function of national government. And I think Mr. Taylor has got a lot to answer for. But further than that, I would also say that you can see the impact of where the DA's augmentation through LEAP has had an impact. So, for case in Younger, as an example, was one of the highest murder rates in the last round of crime, previous round of crime statistics, because of a detailed focus by the City of Cape Town and the province of the Western Cape, both led by the DA. That's been able to be reduced dramatically. So we're doing the best that we can with the resources we have. It's time for national government and Mr. Taylor and the SAPS to come to the party and help join the fight against gangsterism and drugs in these areas.
Wrapping it up then, John, the fact-finding mission, if you were to sum it up in about a minute, what would you say your key findings were, and who were some of the major stakeholders you met, by the way?
The key findings of this war is not going to end anytime soon. Secondly, there are going to be disastrous consequences for Africa and South Africa as food, fuel, fertilizer costs rocket during the worldwide shortage, because there's 30 million tons of important grain that Africa needs, which cannot leave the ports there because they're blockaded. I've built up an incredible network of people while I was there, mayors, governors, the mayor of Kiev, the governor of Lviv. Met with former President, Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. I've met with the former President. I've met with opposition MPs as well as government MPs. I now have established a very good network thanks to one-on-one contact and face-to-face contact with a variety of people who are going to be able to keep me informed of what's actually happening on the ground there so that I can contribute to any debates in South Africa on a factual basis with eyes on the ground.
Leader of the main opposition in South Africa, John Steenhuisen, thank you very much for your time.